Donald Trump comes to Scotland, don't we know, with Saltires fluttering on his motorcade instead of the Union flag. He also describes John Sweeney as a terrific guy, despite not really having met him yet. And he suggests that all the proceeds from removing whisky tariffs should go to Scotland, not to the UK. Is he kind of mixing it, or just does he actually favour Scotland, or is this just more rubbish that will be reversed next week? We discuss. We talk also about the John Swinney's suggestion that there should be a constitutional convention. Again, that's suggested now. Previous weeks, that was ruled out explicitly. And of course, the strategy will be simply to go for an independence referendum with the SNP somehow managing to get over the line as the largest party in 2026. Simples. Again, we take a look at that and at the action that's ongoing against supporters of Gaza and the emergency cabinet meeting in the UK government that's happening right now. Those are the headlines. Now for the podcast.
Well, hi chums, and welcome to this week's star-spangled edition of the Leslie Riddoch podcast. President Trump and assorted hanger-ons and security plopped down at Prestwick last week with the beast bearing the flag of the United States in Scotland with the Saltire on the presidential car on the obvious breach of protocol, and certainly a deliberate one, as Donald swept into Turnberry to hold court with everybody from Keir Starmer to Ursula von der Leyen, and then today, as we're recording, meeting with John Sweeney. Protests felt a bit muted, perhaps, Leslie. What did you think?
Well, this is pretty priceless, actually. I'm still getting communications from people who were arrested, sort of essentially, who were standing beside me saying much the same things at the Palestine demonstration. And quite a few of them are having twice daily visits from the police to make sure they're not breaching bail conditions. So that's kind of what happens when you kind of do it, when you're saying anything. And, you could just be saying free Gaza.
Yeah.
So nothing to do with Palestine action. And of course, that has had a freezing impact, as it was meant to have, on everything to do with marching and demonstrating and so on, I think is point one. I mean, point two is you're not going to get near the action because, here there was the day of action was called. Happily, Saturday coincided vaguely with Trump being here. But if you remember the group that we still have ready to roll at any time, Fraser, the Time for Scotland group. I mean, our mantra, which I bleated on about all the time, is it matters to do things in the moment, not wait until it suits you. So happily, Saturday suddenly did actually work for the media because Trump was around. They needed something. And so even the smallest groups actually got reasonable coverage, which only goes to show that, it is entirely a thing about good timing and positioning does the business for you. But I think people just thought, well, he's actually, they were protesting in Aberdeen, and at that point he was down in Turnberry in Ayrshire, which probably felt a bit disconnected. And even when he's finally up the road at Many Estate today, he's not near, that close to Aberdeen city. So it's all a bit of a guddle, but it's true, actually. I mean, it wasn't exactly massive waves, but it just gets me so annoyed as somebody who regularly does turn out on stuff. Commentators are sort of sitting safely in their kind of, disconnected from everything. We don't lower ourselves to sweat on the streets kind of stuff. There's a huge class aspect of this as well, actually. And there always has been, partly because the SNP leadership never essentially endorsed the all under one banner rallies by bothering to turn up. So it kind of made it look like it was this scruffy activist types that turned up and did the street action, and kind of it's a bit of a cut above for everybody else. But what the commentariat are now sort of saying is, on the one hand, there's no point turning up to demonstrate for anything because it doesn't actually achieve anything. Okay. And then on the other hand, where are they? There hasn't been hundreds of thousands of people. So,
although there were some quite amusing American press reports of people having to be explained live on air to tell their listeners and viewers what a job he was to try and explain some of that. I hope your next job is a hedgehog and things like that had to be kind of translated for an international audience, which was great. And a lot of the international coverage has been about how he's in Scotland and what's happening and what have you. And Donald did say that there was real starvation in Gaza, and refuting Netanyahu, who'd suggested it was a bold-faced lie to say that there was any hunger in Gaza. Trump said, "I don't know, these children look very hungry. There's real starvation stuff."
Mm-hmm. Which, I mean, again, it's great, but you sort of get that sinking feeling that as soon as the heat goes off, if it does, next week he could sort of decide that, a couple of sort of air well,
Drops,
they're
yeah.
almost air bombs actually. They're not. I know they're meant to be airdrops, but everyone will have heard so many people from the humanitarian agencies saying that there's just loads of problems with the airdrops. They're obviously better than nothing, but they've killed people with the weight of them. They cause massive, even greater scrambles and fights, and it's the strongest who manage to kind of get stuff. A lot of it drops in the sea, and people have drowned. It's just, if anybody, that's not a solution, but it could be enough, by next week to make it look to some people as if there's been some aid dropped, and the Israelis are letting some token trucks in, and it will begin to look like what everybody hopes it's going to look like. We want to see this being resolved. So it's really important for the media to stay on this, and show the real, ongoing problem. Because I mean, this morning even there was some. I'm trying to remember who it was. Your man Peter Kyle or something on Good Morning Scotland, and Mr. Gary Robertson gave him a pretty good go on the cabinet meeting that's been called today by Keir Starmer, as if this famine and starvation has come from nowhere. And all the stuff about Keir Starmer being deeply concerned and totally upset. I mean, how can you not have been upset in the run up to this? It's I think that's even aggravating the feeling of just distance that Keir Starmer has kept from this whole thing. So yes. I wondered what you thought when you said that thing. It seems trivial by comparison, but nonetheless, the Saltires flying was a deliberate breach of protocol. Do you think, is Trump just trying to wind up Starmer at the same time as kind of, because he also called John Sweeney a terrific guy. Right? I don't know if he's even ever met him. So how he can think he's terrific before he's met him even, it just sounds like and he had that thing where he was talking about if they manage to change the tariffs that are about to be applied to Scottish whiskey, all the proceeds should stay in Scotland, at which point Keir Starmer jumps in and goes, "Oh, I think we'll just change the subject there."
Well, I mean, these gaffes are
it?
all quite funny if they're not on your side. So I mean, I think a lot of the time you watch these press reports, you're getting questions fired at somebody who's not necessarily that quick on their feet, and is not that focused and doesn't really care what they're saying. So the tariff stuff was actually the whole of the tariff reduction he thought should accrue to Scotland, because it's such a great place, which is why Starmer nearly choked to death in the sidelines.
Yes.
And had to jump in. And in terms of the flag thing, I think somebody would have definitely had to be overruled. That's a kind of a paid job. It's not a political job to organise the right flags for the car. He's certainly very keen on his super large Saltires at Turnberry and at Aberdeenshire, and would have just told them that's what I want and that's what I'm getting. Whether it's a deliberate ploy to wind up Starmer, I wouldn't have thought, and I don't think it necessarily is part of any great agenda. If it was Biden, who was always very keen and kind of pro-Irish quibs and get your Brits out level of accidentally on purpose quips about Britain, then that would have perhaps stacked up. But I think the Donald just likes the image of things, and obviously likes the Saltire when he's in Scotland, and it was quite nice to see it on the beast.
But I mean, people keep asking what's sort of going on with all this whole Trump thing. I've got to say, I'm just sort of monumentally so not interested in him. But you have to obviously pay attention. But I was just looking back because I mean, the last time I wrote something about this, it was about the massive losses being incurred at that golf course that he's at, Many in Aberdeenshire. It's clocked up 11 straight years of losses for Trump International, Balmedy. The last year on record saw their tax losses double to almost $2 million. And the other thing is that's significant about that is that is one of the properties that Trump was found guilty for falsely evaluating. I mean, now, of course, everyone's going, well, whatever he's been found. What is he, 32 times a felon? It reminds me of 12 times a lady or something,
Yeah.
but right, 32 times a felon. So who cares? Because it's just one of the things that's bitten the dust. But the point was, what is this all about? Because he promised, and people may remember back in the day, not just a golf course, it was going to be homes, there was going to be a whole lot of stuff. None of that happened. And the point is that he was found guilty of inflating the valuation of his Scottish golf club property by hundreds of millions of dollars because homes on these properties that were supposed to have been built were not built. But he certified that they were and borrowed hundreds of millions of dollars against them. So, it's funny how this, I don't know because I haven't listened copiously to absolutely everything, but it's kind of like that to me is what springs to mind when somebody starts talking about the Many estate. And yeah, I'm not sure I've heard anybody going through whether it's even washed its face, which presumably, I mean, classic Donald double or quits basically. He's decided to open this other golf course up at Many, determined to make this thing actually, you know, wash its face.
I mean, not all
And
losses
this
are
is giving it
accidental, of
vast.
course, I
Oh,
think could be
but
what I would say in that.
well, let me get to the end there. I was just going to say, I wonder if this is what this is all about. It's just massive promotion for his golf courses.
Oh, it's definitely massive promotion for his golf courses. I mean, that's really the only purpose of this trip is a kind of free press coverage, and that's why they're at pains to say that it's not a state visit and this is just a private visit where he happens to have summoned Ursula von der Leyen to get over the line with these trade negotiations, which has hugely increased the amount of tariffs that the EU has to pay into America, but not by as much as they might otherwise have done. And Starmer and a little bit of Swinney on the side, just for good measure, because you're local and you happen to be around.
Yeah. But anyway, I mean, have you heard much of that sort of analysis? Just that this is a naked promotion of his golf course that's failing, sort of
I mean,
analysis.
I'm always very cautious about the idea that just because it's making a loss that it's failing. I don't know enough about the finances there, but I think a lot of
11
these things.
years?
Well, a lot of these things are deliberately to set up a loss so that they can offset the tax gain against something else, and it's all part of a kind of intricate network of companies and holdings and what have you that all pat each other on the head. So, and of course, Many in particular has been under construction, so everything that they build there will be written off against any profit that they might otherwise make.
God blimey. Right. You learned a lot during your time in the sort of the fast moving place of Westminster, isn't
Yes.
it? God almighty. Anyway, well,
But you,
that's
you
him.
were talking about the protesters, and your article this week was about the Gaza protesters and the kind of absolute waste of everybody's time in basically arresting folk for wearing their own kind of t-shirt.
It was a bit, well, I mean, we spoke about it in the last podcast, but then when it came around to writing a column, I thought, well, it's still kind of pretty much there as an issue. And there was two things that sort of struck me about it. One was that there's kind of, first of all, there's the Palestine Action Appeal. Now, what day is today? Because there should have been a result of that pretty soon.
Yeah, well, this is the 29th
Yeah.
today, Tuesday.
Well, okay, it could be any day now, the result. But anyway, Palestine Action, there we are, said the words, was actually the lawyers were in the court in London trying to argue against proscription by Yvette Cooper. And they had some pretty blooming useful, when you drill down into it, there's some pretty useful lawyers on their side, actually. One of which, and I'm going to just mash this, but is Blinja Nessa Onya Nigralach, Gralach, I'm sure is wrong, who is an Irish human rights lawyer who led the legal challenge. And I mean, I was just commenting in the column that actually her sort of stubborn retention of her full, beautiful Irish name, despite all the problems it will. In fact, if you go online and put her name in and then pronounce, there's about five options come up immediately. So people have such difficulty with it. Now, I mean, anybody else who was a little bit more biddable would just have gone, I think I could just be Blinia, Raleigh or something, but not this lass. She's absolutely holding her to who she is. She's got form in getting people off. There was two activists in 2017 who were arrested for trying to disarm Typhoon jets that were going to Saudi Arabia to bomb Yemen, and she got an acquittal for them. But perhaps the one people will most remember is the Colston Four. Those were the folk that were charged with toppling the Colston statue in Bristol into the sea in 2020. I mean, the jury acquitted the protesters, and I don't know if you all remember, it all seems like ancient history now, but it was just January 2022. And I mean, that seemed extraordinary because we'd all watched it happening on television. But so the point would be that, she's a pretty powerful activist in this kind of field of human rights. And it does seem extraordinary that here's some professionals that are willing to kind of put their, shoulders to the grindstone on this, who are human rights specialists, against a government led by a supposedly human rights lawyer called Keir Starmer. But I mean, she also was involved actually she represented the South Africans at the International Court of Justice when the court decided to accuse Israel of genocide. So she's got some pretty strong things to say, and it will be interesting to see, what comes out of that in the end. Compare and contrast on this question of professionals. The blooming run for cover, I'm sorry to say, in Scotland on this, it struck me that it would be possible, and you may know more about this, it would be possible for some guidelines to be issued by the Lord Advocate or whatever to say, okay, we can't intervene with the Terrorism Act. It's a UK thing. Yep, that's fine. But we can issue guidelines to the police as to what we think constitutes a terrorism act as regards Palestine action. Because, folk who just were holding signs with Free Gaza are now finding themselves actually up for arrest.
I think it's perfectly possible. I mean, the police in Scotland work under the auspices of the Crown Office. It's the Lord Advocate that directs prosecutions and tells the police how to go about their business. So I really don't see at all why the Lord Advocate couldn't have issued guidance to the police to say, actually, we're not going to be running around prosecuting folk for T-shirts, because there's a difference between lawful protest and terrorism. Now, yes, the Terrorism Act is reserved, and it's only within the gift of the UK government to prescribe these organisations to decide which one is out and which one is in. But there's a difference between advocating and supporting terrorism and simply campaigning against the proscription of Palestine action and complaining about this kind of overreach. And we've also seen various UN special rapporteurs coming out to criticise the UK government's use of terrorism powers to stifle legitimate protest against the humanitarian and genocide actions in Gaza. So, it wasn't as if you were going to be out of kilter with the kind of mainstream of international opinion. And at a time when Police Scotland are having to fork out £5 million to keep Donald from coming into any harm and to deal with any protests at the two sites that we've mentioned, why we would want to have police time and court time and prosecution time taken up on such low-level non-offences, which were effectively a political decision taken by Yvette Cooper. Seems beyond to me. I think if I was the Justice Minister, I would have probably come out the following day saying, of course, I can't direct the police or the prosecution services in this country, but this is a political decision, and I don't see why we should be having to pay for it here.
And if we're going bonkers here, John Sweeney could have made some kind of comment, or since he's already had a summit about the dangers of the far right in public life, he could have said something. I mean, the point is just that Scots who are activists, and let's just say you were saying there that actually the position that many marchers were taking coincides with what's now happening politically, but crucially came before it, right? And that's the role of activism, is to push for the political classes, because they rarely come in advance of where the public's at. So, here we are now with the first recall for a very long time, I think, of the cabinet in the summer. So we're getting into famous firsts. And at the same time, just while we're at it, it's interesting to note that the proscription of Palestine Action was apparently the first time ever that a non-violent direct action group has ever been proscribed. So this is how weird this is. And of course, people would get out into the middle of it. So, but this is still going on. These checkups that bail conditions are being observed, which strikes me as harassment.
Yeah, it's completely designed simply to stifle lawful protest. I mean, even the girls that are being prosecuted for banging into the fence at Leonardo are being charged with, what is it, mischievous acts. With a terrorism aggravator, and I think it's quite widely known that obviously their homes have been raided to try and see if they can find some evidence of a wider terrorist plot, rather than simply protest and vandalism as a means of getting over a political point, like the kind of Greenham Common and Faz Lane and various other places where criminal damage has been done in order to make a point.
Well, just for final word on this, the valiant Blynia, I'm just going to call her, the lawyer that appeared for the Palestine Action Law, actually mentioned this, that she said that people in Merseyside have been bailed, protesters that were arrested have been bailed on the condition they do not mention Palestine. And when she announced that in the court, the Justice Chamberlain was obviously quite surprised and said essentially, what? And she said, yeah, that's the bail conditions. And she pointed out that Yvette Cooper had not distanced herself from that and had not described such an action as overreach. So this is where we are. You start to get, you think you're doing something clever. This so reminds me of Gordon Brown and is putting Iceland, the country of Iceland, in case anyone's in any confusion, on the terrorism register back after the financial crash in 2008. Which kind of really hardened opinion, probably helped people in Iceland realise that they had to take some very tough action against their own banks, which was largely why their economy pretty much sprang back quicker than ours, though still lots of problems. But really, the country of Iceland at that point were on the terrorism register with Al Qaeda and, all that bunch. It was kind of just so wrong. But anyway, there we are, just sidling up to the, to the sort of arrest possibilities again. So let's move on.
Although, just kind of around that, just as we move on, you mentioned the cabinet recall. This is to discuss a so-called Gaza peace plan, really as a result of Starmer coming under increasing pressure to follow the move of President Macron of France and recognise the state of Palestine.
Yeah, and Conor, if you keep hearing the discussions about that, and I suppose interviewers are having to chuck the point back that will this achieve, because it's a Keir Starmer view that somehow there's no point in acknowledging or recognising a Palestinian state until you got all your ducks in a row. There's a whole agreement, there's a ceasefire, and it's all ready to go. And I mean, quite obviously, loads of countries around us, France, Norway, Spain, Ireland, don't think that, and it makes you kind of wonder how, I've got to say, in some respects, Keir Starmer and John Swinney's plans about independence are sort of, there's a bit of a similarity there in that somehow you're going to wait till absolutely everything is all done and dusted, and then you'll come out and, in your big moment, you'll say the thing. And lots of people will say, with regard to Palestine, there's a question of what is physically left of it since it's been pulverized and the West Bank is being settled as we speak. But that just adds all the more urgency to have at least some kind of bulwark, some line in the sand put down by an international community that is not acting in concert. So, I mean, really, that is the least you can do. And the slowness and caginess, and what is wrong with Keir Starmer? I mean, did he spend time as a human rights lawyer? It beggars belief to me. Although, again, you can look at the case for a two-state solution in Palestine, Israel, and there's many people who don't think that'll work. But then you've got to ask, what do you think will work? And we have to get to a stage now where we get something that's workable moving.
And you have to also make a kind of strong international showing against the state of Israel to say this has gone far too far. I mean, Keir Starmer does seem to be tiptoeing up to that now, and you've obviously had the comments we talked about earlier from Trump. I mean, Netanyahu's really pushed the envelope way beyond any level of acceptable action, and it's pretty incredible that the majority of Western states are not standing up and saying, no, we're not having that. You'll need to stop. And this is how you're going to stop. And it's not a question you're being told, why we've got a situation where the UK is helping to airdrop aid into a starvation event that's been entirely caused by the actions of another state.
But you hear, again, when you listen to the commentary on that on the Beeb radio or whatever, people will quite, the reporters will be quite carefully saying, now they're saying it's a human-made, famine, but it's an Israeli government-made famine. And so I think the Beeb is now feeling a bit braver because it's not suggesting this is kind of like a natural catastrophe or anything. But as ever, this is so far behind the curve. It's almost, where's the public opinion? It is that unquestionably Israel is responsible for starving Gaza. And where does the Beeb pitch itself? Kind of one back, maybe two back from that, just to be on the safe side. And actually, our politicians pretty much the same. I mean, we really, I've said this before, but many people were skeptical about Hamza Yousaf's time at the top. But by gum, there was no doubt across the world about where he stood on these things. And it gave a kind of conscience to Scotland that just still feels a bit missing now.
Yeah, sadly. Well, from Donald Trump and jobbies to Scottish water and pollution. The bold Steve Reid telling Porky Pigs on Porky Pies even on the Channel 4 News.
Yeah, well, it could be Porky Pigs as well. But anyway, he did he did sort of declare basically that Steve Reid, who's the Environment Minister for England, that whilst he's on the back foot completely about the state of water in England, which is now just catastrophic, he mentioned in the course of some rant that Scottish water pollution levels in Scotland are worse than they are in England, which is just... Now, I know there's problems. There's definitely problems in England. And you were mentioning a piece actually that, well, you go for it, the bit that was mentioned for Portobello and so on.
Well, yes. I mean, so Steve Reid had a go at it on Channel 4, and then Chris Murray, the MP for Edinburgh Eastern, which includes Portobello. I hope I've got the constituency right. I think they changed the name recently, and I've probably mangled that. Equally is out and about campaigning regularly about the state of Portobello Beach, and there have been some serious problems there, but he's been criticised in the past in November for saying there were pollution leaks when there weren't, and he was on television this week agreeing with Steve Reid that Scotland suffered excess pollution in its water, and that coincided with an interesting article by Adam Ramsey talking about this new MP, Chris Murray, and how he's looking to be... I think
we have to chuck the word in Labour here at this point.
Labour, certainly, very much so. A kind of supine backbench Labour MP wanting to be a good local MP and he was outdoor knocking in Portobello and chapped the wrong door when he got Adam, and absolutely refused to answer any questions or have any discussion on things that actually came under his purview. Only
Like
interested,
Gaza.
like Gaza, completely not interested to talk about Gaza. Kept trying to change the subject. I'll put a link in the show notes to the articles. It's well worth looking at, and it raises kind of wider issues about what an MP should be for, because a lot of these MPs are basically trying to be local councillors.
Aye,
Or kind of zooped up social workers so that they can be seen to be out and about. It kind of reminded me of Danny DeVito and other people's money, talking about lawyers. They've got theirs, so I've got to have mine. It was the kind of same about constituency caseworkers, this type of local advice, and basically trying to kind of stick your nib into things that aren't actually anything to do with you. Has grown and grown over the last 20 to 30 years.
But it's certainly true that every layer of government is kind of in and about what ought to be the purview of the lower layer. So MSPs are also guddling around in what should be councillor stuff. But as far as the MPs, and there's a political thing in here, obviously, because at the moment, since the last election, most MPs are Labour, and most of the devolved powers in Holyrood are run by a SNP, Scottish Government. So having a pop at Scottish Water by a Labour MP is another way of sort of undermining confidence in the SNP and the Scottish Government. But I mean, Believe in Scotland, and we'll put the link in the notes as well, have very good article that brought a lot of this together and pointed out that SEPA was actually, that's an independent regulator, says that 87% of water bodies in Scotland are either good or excellent, and that's the highest proportion ever. And actually, I'm sure I saw something that, I wish I remembered it now, extraordinary, that Scotland actually has something like 20% of the fresh water in Europe. I mean, it's quite extraordinary how much water we've got. So that's quite a lot of good water. There's all sorts of different reports. Here's another one. There was an independent water commission led by Sir John Cunliffe. So people that like their independent regulators to be knighted in some way, here's one for you. And it found that 66% of Scotland's water bodies were in good ecological status. Right, that's 66% Scotland, 16% England, 29% Wales. So it's kind of okay. And customer satisfaction, 81% in Scotland, 55% in England. I mean, you could go on and on, just the number of fines. Scottish Water has had one fine of 6,000 quid, could have been for Portobello. There have been, I mean, I can't even add up how many millions, probably billions now, of fines for repeatedly flouting rules about sewage in the privatised water businesses of England. And that's the next point, because whatever is done here about sort of abolishing the Ofwat, the regulator in England, amalgamating it with something else, you don't get round that you've still got, I think, 19 privatised water and sewerage companies south of the border and Wales, which is the fundamental problem that nobody will tackle.
Yeah. All these fines are taking money out of the system, and all of these huge bonuses, which even still are continuing despite criticism from the UK government, with the English water companies taking out excessive bonuses, even when they're tittering on the edge of absolute bankruptcy, and the profit taking doesn't leave any money for the investment, and there's been huge dereliction of duty in England, but there are obviously a higher population in England, so there are slight difficulties comparing like with like for Scotland. But even if you look at the amount of sewer system there is per 10,000 kilometres of sewer in Scotland, there's been 36 category 1 to 3 water waste incidents, whatever that means, but naughty bad things where things have come out they shouldn't have done, comparison to 41 incidents for every 10,000 kilometres in England. So, by any measure, Scottish Water is doing a much better job than in England. There is certainly a ways to go for improvement, and climate change will continue to cause problems here because the majority, particularly in Scotland, of these instances come when the system is inundated with rainwater, and a proportion of rainwater has to be let out into rivers or into the sea rather than going to waste treatments, just because the volume and the pressure is so high. But the actual toilet water, if you like, content of that is something in the region of 1%. So the majority of that is rainwater being washed out. But it does have a detrimental impact on bathing waters. And we have seen places like Portobello closed because of the poor water quality situation after heavy rainfall incidents. Part of that at Portobello is also contributed by the amount of dog walkers and dog filing on the beach, and kind of wet wipes and other rubbish and gulls and gull feces, which are attracted.
Honestly, it's enough. Right?
I know, it's a delightful topic of conversation.
Isn't it? But the other thing we should say is that, it isn't all perfect, as you were mentioning there. I mean, I swim regularly in the Tay and stuff, and I'm now swimming right outside my house, which is actually back up the Tay estuary a bit. And I mean, the level of concern there is from people around. And I'm saying, look, wherever I'm swimming in the sea, it's salt water, so I'm not gulping it down, So these could be famous last words, or they could just not be. My neighbour is a great sort of something boarder, and he's out in the water as well. I mean, okay, this could be a dodgy thing to get into, but what strikes me is just the level. If more of us were using the water, we would actually get more angry about what is going on. And one of the things that's going on is that the top executives of Scottish Water in the last sort of financial year, this was a report just in April, pulled in about £250,000 in performance-related bonuses. And so, so that still, there's an awful lot of kind of fat cat stuff sitting around Scottish Water, but that's our problem, and we should be making, pardon the pun, making more waves about just how we maintain the lead that having public control over water should have given us. But for sure, the notion that your man is actually trying to claim that Scottish water is worse than English water, it does just kind of make you realise that they're actually very nervous about these kind of better provisions, because that I can't even believe someone's stupid enough that they didn't know that. And I don't know if this is kind of taking us into where you were planning to go, but one thing that's interesting about it, people will know, I guess, that the reason that Scotland's got public supply is because Strathclyde Region decided to hold an advisory referendum back in 1994, and it had a massive turnout. 71% of electors returned their papers, and astonishingly, 97% of them wanted Scottish Water to stay in public hands. And the interesting point that's highlighted by the Believe in Scotland article is that referendum had no legal force, but it was an act. It was a forceful act. And of course, the UK, this is before there was a Scottish government or parliament or anything, right? So the UK government still had the legal power to do what it wanted with Scottish Water. But instead of kind of going, oh, well, there's no point in us even trying because, hey, we can't get through at the finishing line. We haven't got control over this. Charlie Gray, who was a Labour man at the time, but actually voted yes in 2014. Sadly, he's passed now. But Charlie decided that they were going to go hell for leather with that referendum to just throw a big spanner in the works. And, this could be a bit of a kind of thing to think about in context of where we are now, with John Sweeney suddenly announcing he wants to put a convention together as a strategy. He's got also a strategy for independence that we probably are going to discuss now.
Well, which we panned last week and just seems to be getting worse by the telling. You don't have to be, as Blackadder said, a fox who's chair of cunning studies at Cambridge to realise that this is nae a cunning plan, not cunning and not a plan. I mean, if you just look at the timeline of this, they started off earlier in the year with Angus Robertson absolutely ruling out any notion of a independence convention. We then, last week, had John Swinney coming out to say that the only way to advance independence was for the SNP to do well. this week around the Trump stuff, we've had John Swinney go further than that and say that actually, in order to demonstrate democratic legitimacy for a second referendum, which he is putting forward as the only legal, safe, or constitutional route to achieving independence, readers, it's not. Is that the SNP actually secure a majority and go back to the 2011 breakthrough. And further, now having come up with this strategy, announced it, and said this is the only way you can go, wants to have a bringing together of everybody in the Yes movement and wider Civic Scotland as part of an independence constitutional convention. You're just like, yeah, what?
Well, there's a very this has just popped up before we started recording, and there's a very interesting exchange going on in the national newspaper, which just at the moment, folks, is 20 quid for a year to subscribe to. A pretty good value, I'd suggest. But anyway, there's a lot of kind of to and froing. A lot of people saying, look, this is what everybody wanted, was to have some sort of everybody's in it together kind of move. Just suck it up and stop assuming that there will be problems along the way. A lot of people making that point, that they assume that the SNP will make a prerequisite is basically accepting that the only way through is to get, the majority of SNP seats, and that will lead you to be able to push for a referendum, which in itself, again, is the only way to get independence. I mean, this is, to me, this is sort of almost like not, it feels like not the argument, because I'm just going to go back to that Scottish Water point. You have to start acting as if you really mean business, and not with a kind of, we can definitely get this. It would be a bit like you playing basketball, and unless you're able to throw really accurately and well, and you yourself can get the thing through the hoop in one massive throw from the back line, you're not going to move. Whereas the game is that you pass, you move up, you feint, you confuse, you swerve, you get past people, you do stuff to move your way to make that last bucket much, much more inevitable to sink. So standing on the back tram line is just not a way to run anything. And there's actually, in that discourse underneath the National article, there's a great comment made by James Murphy, who's going through a whole long history of all the countries that have become independent. And it made me nearly sit and check actually the sequence of events, but didn't have enough time to do it. But he's kind of making the point that Ireland, the Baltic states, Slovenia, Norway, Montenegro, Czech Republic, they basically all asserted their independence first and then did a referendum. Now, I'm not totally sure about that, but it's quite possible that's true, actually, because when you speak to certainly Norwegians and Estonians, it's all sufficient. Well, with the Norwegians who became independent in 1905, it's not just a blur, it's kind of beyond anyone's living memory. But for the Estonians, for whom this happened in 1991, so 34 years ago, nobody can quite remember which thing happened first, because they just were absolutely intent. They used everything. Whether it was the Baltic chain as a media event, whether they did indeed have a referendum sometime in the middle of all that. They also had a thing that you were declaring your statehood as Estonian, which for them fortunately relied upon the fact that many states didn't recognize the intervening Russian control period as legitimate. But they were trying everything on every front. And I'm not sure people thought, that they certainly didn't have authority from Moscow to sort of hold a referendum, but they asserted their own right to do it. And perhaps they actually had that right legally. I don't know. The Irish didn't. So it's kind of a very persuasive argument that you just can't be standing still and hoping to hit the target. And unfortunately, that does sound really what John Swinney is aiming for. And the piece that James Murphy has written concludes, what's missing from Swinney's strategy: no parallel or transitional institutions, no withdrawal from UK state functions, no credible transition plan, no intent to act on a mandate without UK consent, instead symbolic conventions, no timeline, no decisive point of action. And, I think I totally agree with him. Independence doesn't come from waiting, it comes from acting. And that doesn't mean violence action. It doesn't need to be that. But you do need political will and courage to basically move on what you can. And that's, I think, where this one, we can all sit and have arguments about whether or not the international community recognises independences that are not accompanied by referenda, legal ones. It's been a wee while since there's been one, and actually nobody's been in this problem before. I think the last folk over the line were the Estonians, and they had a legal referendum. So it's kind of like we're focusing on this and we're just not looking at all the stuff that could be. Just in this podcast alone, we've been talking about all sorts of ways that John Sweeney could be showing, not telling, that we've got a different attitude towards Gaza by supporting people who are protesting. But I mean, in much more tangible ways, there's loads of things that could be being done. On the electricity front, just gathering steam to go up and make the film up around Inverness about the kind of wind farm overload. And God, I've got to tell you, it gars me greet that I seem to be on the same blooming wavelength as Donald Trump and his allergy to the offshore wind farm off Aberdeenshire. But for the folk who live in the Highlands, 1,300 applications at the moment, and no chance whatsoever they can actually even produce wind once they're constructed because there's not enough grid connection to get them to England, where the energy is destined to go. So this is a messed up energy system, with a light being shone now by the unusual stirring of Highland folk to just say enough is enough on this front. Again, the Scottish government is acting as if all it can do is rubber stamp, because of an Energy Act, what is coming from Westminster as the will of Westminster. It could be demanding community benefit. It could be demanding community energy gets connected first. There's all sorts of things that could be being done. There's a great piece by Dave Pearson, who is the guy that does the heat pumps that take heat from the water. And he's suggesting we should just forget the grid and start to just put private lines in from wind farms to neighbouring towns and set up district heating powered by the wind energy from the wind farms beside them. There's all sorts of problems with that legally, because legally energy all has to go into the grid. Test it. I mean, all of this is waiting for somebody who just is looking for a way through what is an intolerable situation with all these things. So it's a long way of coming back to the beginning again and just saying this alone is not going to be enough.
Well, just very briefly, I mean, you can definitely have private wire, and there's nothing to stop you from doing that. And putting it into district heating means that you're not having to distribute the electricity into individual people's homes, which gives you more of a problem.
But the problem with it is, I'm told that you can't have two inputs of. So if you have a private wire, you can't then have the national grid. And apparently, because this is a problem they had in Applecross, they could have done that. But that seems to be the rules. I'll stand to be corrected. And it gives people a little nervousness, because if you're told it's this, which is a kind of pioneering step, not backed by a government, and it could be, or the national grid, which sounds as kind of concrete and dependable as it is, people begin to get a bit nervous, which is one of the reasons we haven't moved very far on the private,
I mean,
anyway.
We better get off this before we get pelters from people who actually know what they're talking about. The underlying thing is that basically to prevent you from electrifying the grid and zapping somebody working up a pole because he thinks he's turned off the grid and there's nothing connected, but actually you've got a private generating setting on the opposite side. And now there are ways of getting around that and modern systems that prevent that from happening.
Anyway,
but yeah, that's the underlying problem.
Back to independence, this was an extended analogy, which brings us back. Because the other thing that strikes me about it is Swinney is kind of saying this is the thing that he will launch at the conference in November, which is then a kind of canter to the line, for an election in May. There's clearly a move amongst many branches to put forward a proposal that the next election is used as a de facto referendum. And as I understand it, a great many branches have signed up to that. Yeah. And I wonder if this is basically seeing what's coming, because it will be a real showdown, and trying to make it, here's an alternative, and basically putting Swinney's leadership on the line.
Quite probably. I think it is definitely a bit of conference management. And as I was saying, if you sit down yourself and think, how would I go about doing this, or how, if you had any kind of proposition, never mind independence, and you wanted a whole bundle of people to fall in behind you, the last thing you would do was say, I'm not talking to anybody. A couple of weeks later, say, here is my strategy. And then the week after that, saying, now I wonder if everybody could come together and we can have a chat about it.
Sure, but on the other hand, I mean, I can see some of the point of, well, but we're here now. It now really is incumbent on the SNP to really reach out to people and not put tripwires and sorts of problems in the way of people coming together on this. And the other inconsistency I'd notice is in some occasions and interviews, it sounds as if John Sweeney was not saying SNP 1 and 2, as in was saying, we want the first past the post votes and then we want you to support an independence party on the list. But then when he was asked directly about it, jumped back to SNP 1 and 2. And I don't know if you'll be better on the maths,
No,
my dear.
well, I mean,
do they need 1 and 2 to get that SNP majority that he's calling for?
I mean, I can't remember how many seats they got on the list in 2011 off the top of my head, but it was a very small numbers. But they did require those additional list seats in areas where they didn't get the constituency in order to get across the line. And to go from getting whatever it was, 33% of the vote that they're currently polling and winning an outright majority on the constituency vote alone, when you're really not supposed to get a majority on the combined vote, never mind on just the first, does seem very, very difficult and extremely unlikely, which is why I think a lot of people are very annoyed with this being hard baked in as the only route to independence for the SNP to secure a majority. We're setting up hurdles for ourselves to cross, which are not thought through. And which don't have the support and the backing of other political parties in support of independence, and don't have the support of the majority, I would say, of independent supporters.
Well, just while you're speaking, I've had a quick look, and the SNP won in 2011, won 53 constituency seats, and then when the list seats were added, the total was 69. So it looks like they won 16 list seats, which gave them the majority over, an overall majority. The Greens won too. So it does look like they, on that occasion, if we're going for 2011, this is almost without saying it, saying that's a justification for SNP 1 and 2 if they're making it all about the SNP. Anyway, God, you can go around in circles and all of this. The point that all the same is that if you're not going to actively campaign, it just keeps coming back to this. This has to be a vibrant. Even when he was talking about, did Swinney not meet Starmer at some point, or von der Leyen? I can't remember.
Von der Leyen.
Right. There was a comment on what subjects were being discussed. And just for once, I mean, I'm thinking about the people, the young folk down in Oxford who are the ones that started Europe for Scotland, who've got no skin in this game. They're not Scottish at all. And they've got 19 committees in European EU member countries. They're constantly on the go. We're having another meeting about how the Europeans can advance the cause of Scotland being independent and being able to choose whether or not to rejoin the EU. And there's a moment when John Swinney is talking to Ursula von der Leyen, and there's a little digest of the things that he's mentioned, and there's no mention at all of this. And, when there's ways that this could be made relevant, because there is still an expansion programme for the European Union. They have considered the expansions that might happen with the inclusion, perhaps, of Ukraine and some countries to the east. But it would make perfect sense to say, we want you to remember that we, keep the lights on. We want to be the state that re-enters from the West, should the people of Scotland so. Now, that could have been an easy thing to just feed in as a press line. And if you're going to keep independence alive and on the front page, you have to grab moments like this and insert the different reality that you're in charge of trying to promote.
Certainly, although we don't know what they actually discussed, and I think he managed to get this meeting with Ursula von der Leyen without anyone for the FCDO there to do any hand-holding. So
That'll be
George
the
Fawkes
Foreign Office for the rest of us.
was doing his usual, and steam coming out of his ears that he'd managed to slip the minders again, despite having got into trouble last year for whatever it was. And we were definitely going to make sure that we always had Foreign Office official with us whenever we go out and about. So what they actually discussed and what was in the communique won't necessarily have been the same thing, but if we look at the comment we had the other week about whether Swinney should have been meeting with Trump, he wouldn't have got to meet with von der Leyen if he hadn't been meeting with Trump. And you just have to be available and see what comes your way.
It seems to me this is still the problem with it, because I can quite appreciate that within the game that is formal politics, it is quite something to slip your minders and to get a meeting with a head of state without the Foreign Office, chaperone, basically insisting that they are in the room with you. Meanwhile, back for everybody else, there was a meeting there and just an opportunity to raise something to do with independence that was not raised. It might have been privately, but then why you would do it privately and not publicly? Oh, is that back to then you get the Foreign Office annoyed because you're really stretching the boundaries of what you're allowed to talk about?
And
well,
you're telling
hello.
people about it.
Exactly. That's exactly what you have to do. And I mean, you don't need to be a kind of complete late Alex Salmond supporter to think that there are different ways to promote your cause, but one of them has got to be that look at the Scots do love a fighter, and they do love underdogs. So everybody who's basically walking up to the line and just kind of saying, I'm walking the line here, and I'm dipping over it, that gets a lot of respect. And I'm afraid towing the line, getting your best jacket on, and speaking the words that everyone has been speaking for such a long time, I appreciate that might be quite a diplomatic result, but for the public that's been listening to the same stuff for ages, it's nothing.
Yeah. I mean, he did obviously mention commitment to work with European partners on key issues, including energy. I think I would have probably made that aspect of the communique a lot stronger, and, Scotland's contribution to energy in Europe. But yeah, there's different ways that could have been.
But see, even there, right? What does that mean? Because the way that the public's feeling at the moment, I think many of the public just feel that we are witnessing basically an extractive moment where renewables are just being taken, and we've still got the highest bills pretty much in Europe. And so if you're talking about kind of working with Europe, unless you specify something that suggests that the average Scottish bill payer is going to benefit at long last from this, and is going to get some of the jobs, and
yeah,
then it just sounds like another bit of our assets are being wheeled off now to Europe rather than to England. So, I mean, this just needs so much more savviness, because the people are up to speed with how much we are basically watching our assets walk. So, it needs, and I think even when I come back to the Scottish Water thing, I'm not sure that the Scottish government leapt into action on that clear mistake. It ended up being groups like Believe in Scotland who did a forthright kind of rebuttal. I might be doing a disservice, but I didn't see it.
I think that there was some comeback, and certainly Scottish Water themselves came out. But yeah, there was not enough clear blue water between them. Talking of being wheeled off, Mary Black is out of the SNP, and Maggie Chapman has been bumped off the top list of the Greens rankings for the Holyrood 2026 election, making it highly unlikely that she'll be elected. She's been moved to second in the regional list.
Yeah, I must say it's a northeast list. I don't know. There's an awful lot of politics going on with the Greens, which people are trying to get up to speed with. Unless you've been quite steeped in it, it's hard to see quite what that means. I mean, Maggie was deputy co-leader at one point, I think, and at some point Lorna Slater sort of elbowed her out of that role. So she came back. So I don't know where she'll end up. As far as Mary Black's concerned, that's kind of, for a lot of people, that's a bit of a moment because there's, an awful lot of people that just liked her style, basically, liked her speeches. Um, it seems when you read down to what really was the last straw for her, it was the deeply divisive issue of the Gender Recognition Act, which she clearly is on one side of, and you would have to say your previous employer, Joanna Terry, was on the other side of. But I think a lot of people are not, although that was her reasoning, a lot of people are looking at it and just thinking there's a kind of it just feels like there's a, well, political class that doesn't have the stomach for confrontation with the British state, to quote one commenter on it. And that, I suppose, is what people are drawing from the Mary Black thing, just that it looked like she was more up for a bit of a fight. Whether or not that would ever have happened, we don't know, because she was, in Westminster and doing a particular role. So it's hard to know really how much that's a massive problem. It's whether it's representative of people just giving up around the place, and we won't know that till we get near the conference.
No, I mean, obviously she's been stood down as an MP, and didn't fight the last election. I suppose we talked earlier about being a good local MP and what that actually meant. There are certainly some suggestions that that wasn't really her thing either, in terms of sort of assiduously taking up local people's issues. There were some really great barnstorming speeches in the Commons, but they were seldom. I mean, Mary has had some health issues which have kept her away from the chamber, but letting that aside, there were certainly long periods of time where she was perhaps not a particularly active member of the Westminster team. And there was always a bit of shock and surprise when SNP members or the wider public saw her as a potential future leader. She was perhaps not putting in the same amount of effort as other people at either end, either in the kind of public stuff or in the kind of background. So it's an interesting one. It is obviously entirely surrounding her fringe show and an opportunity to get headlines, and it's one of the, it's an easy thing to achieve, resigning from a political party, and it gets you some coverage. She's obviously got a natural constituency of people who like her and want to go and see her and listen to what she has to say. I think some of the stuff about the toxicity of Westminster is a bit overblown, frankly. And there was an element of SNP bingo in some of the speech making. It's the kind of usual stuff, obscenity of nuclear weapons and railing against Thatcherite economics. But she had a much greater cut through than lots and lots of other backbench politicians. And that will certainly be missed.
Well, for sure. And I suppose, again, it's this difference between being in the machine and judging people by whether they turn up, whether they're team players, whether they do this, that, or the next thing. And the very small amount that people see outside that, because, I mean, hardly anyone's even watching Prime Minister's questions or indeed First Minister's questions. But yet, the speeches that she gave were fearless looking. She sounded like a different class. She is. And it just, in the way she spoke, I mean, sometimes Stephen Flynn had some of that same sort of just come on if you think you're hard enough look. But some of that is what people don't see in any parliament, is somebody who's just basically going for it, who also seems to have memorized a lot of the speech so that she's able to sort of basically shoot from the hip. And so much, I mean, we come back to something we were talking about earlier about the way MPs are trying to be a good local MP because that looks like they've got traction, they're rated and so on. It's strange the things that people are rated for. And I've said this before, in a country where I think a lot of people have been tongue-tied by the fear of judgment about their accent as somehow being inadequate, and also just a generalised anxiety about judgment when you speak. Someone who is articulate gets disproportionate welly. That happened, I think, to Nicola Sturgeon because she was articulate. She was a very, very good communicator. And people were willing to suspend all judgment on other aspects of her leadership because that one counted for so much. I mean, for so long, all we have had is the ability of people to say something that represents the Scottish outlook. The thing is that we now have a government that should be doing stuff that embodies the Scottish outlook. And even if they were stumbling people who were shy and could hardly string a sentence together, personally speaking now, I wouldn't give a toss because I just want to see one thing go over the line that is brave and represents where we want to be, where our assets are, and shows that we mean business. So for sure, I mean, watching any of Mary's speeches, it definitely gives you a bit of a kind of feeling of welly. But this is kind of the Scottish curse that we rate this bravado. You know, it's like the Highland Charge where, you know, classically the Highlanders just roared and ran with their, you know, with their kind of swords out and running, in the hope that they would hit something, and then got hit by a volley of fire from a better armed army. So great, let's have speeches, but let's have action.
Well, with the returning Little Thompsons who are still on their blinking summer holidays, I don't know how many days out of 47 this is yet still to go. On that impassioned note, we will see you next week, chums.